In 1985, a family vanished on a frozen lake in Minnesota. The ice never cracked. No one fell through. But Mark and Susan Hendricks, along with their 2 children, disappeared mid-glide as if the winter itself had swallowed them whole. For 39 years, Clearwater Lake kept its secret. Until last month, when the drought forced the water level down, and what emerged from the muddy bottom revealed a truth so dark, it explains why some cases were never meant to be solved. Welcome to Lost Mystery Stories. Before we uncover what really happened to the family that vanished on ice that never broke, tell me in the comments, have you ever felt like someone was watching you when you thought you were alone? And if you believe the darkest secrets eventually surface, hit that subscribe button because this story will change how you see small-town America forever. December 14, 1985. Clearwater Lake, Minnesota. The mercury hung at a steady 18 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to keep the lake frozen solid but warm enough for a family to spend the afternoon skating. Mark Hendricks, 34, had driven his wife Susan, 31, and their children, Emma, 8, and Jake, 6, to the lake that Saturday for what should have been their winter tradition. But this wasn't a spontaneous family outing. Mark had been acting strange for weeks, checking locks twice, making hushed phone calls, and jumping at unexpected sounds. Susan had confided to her sister that Mark seemed scared of something, or someone. Mark wasn't himself those last few weeks, said Susan's sister, Linda Morrison. He kept saying they needed to spend more time together as a family, like he was running out of time. Susan thought he was having a midlife crisis, but looking back, it felt more like he was saying goodbye. Carol Brennan lived in the cabin overlooking the lake and had watched the Hendricks family arrive around 1 p.m. But what she witnessed that day was different from the happy family skating she'd later described to police. They weren't laughing like I told the deputies, Carol admitted in 2024, nearly 40 years later. Mark kept looking over his shoulder. Susan seemed nervous. The kids were excited, but the parents, they looked like they were waiting for something bad to happen. At 2:30 p.m., Carol noticed a second vehicle parked in the trees beyond the public access, a dark van with tinted windows. She couldn't see who was inside, but it hadn't been there when the Hendricks arrived. At 2:47 p.m., she watched the family skating in the center of the lake. Mark was holding Susan's hand, but not romantically, protectively, like he was trying to keep her close. Emma and Jake stayed within a tight circle around their parents. Then Carol saw movement near the shoreline. 2 figures in dark winter clothing had emerged from the van and were walking onto the ice. She turned away to check her pot roast. When she looked back 5 minutes later, the lake was empty. The van was gone. The Hendricks blue Chevy sat alone in the parking lot, keys hanging from the ignition. Carol Brennan called the sheriff's department at 3:15 p.m., but she didn't tell them about the van or the 2 figures on the ice. Not then. I was scared, she admitted decades later. Those men, there was something about the way they moved. Purposeful. Professional. I knew if I mentioned them, I might end up like the Hendricks family. Deputy Sheriff Tom Morrison arrived at 3:32 p.m. and found exactly what Carol had reported. 4 pairs of boots, a thermos of hot chocolate, and no family. The ice showed no signs of breaking. The lake was shallow and clear. If anyone had fallen through, they would have been visible on the bottom. But Morrison's investigation was brief and incomplete. Within hours, he declared it a tragic accident and suggested the family had somehow fallen through thin ice despite all evidence to the contrary. Morrison was dirty, said retired FBI agent Sarah Chin, who reviewed the case in 2024. His report was filled with conclusions that contradicted his own evidence. Someone told him what to write. The search lasted only 3 days, unusually short for a missing family case. Volunteers were discouraged from helping. Outside agencies were told their assistance wasn't needed. The media was told the family had likely drowned and that continued coverage would be insensitive to the grieving relatives. By December 18, the case was officially closed. No bodies recovered. No real investigation conducted. No questions asked. But someone had made sure the Hendricks family's disappearance would be forgotten quickly and quietly. What the 1985 investigators didn't know, or chose not to investigate, was that the Hendricks weren't the first family to vanish from the Clearwater area. In 1979, the Peterson family had disappeared during a camping trip near the lake. Their campsite was found undisturbed, but the family was gone. The case was ruled a probable bear attack, though no evidence of bears was found. In 1981, two teenagers had vanished while fishing from a boat on Clearwater Lake. Their boat was found anchored and undamaged, but the teens were never seen again. The official cause was listed as accidental drowning. In 1983, an elderly couple had disappeared from their cabin on the lake's north shore. Their car was found running in the driveway, front door open, dinner still warm on the table. They were presumed to have suffered some form of medical emergency and wandered into the woods. 7 disappearances in 6 years, all near Clearwater Lake. All ruled accidents or natural causes. All investigated by the same sheriff's department. All closed quickly with minimal investigation. It's statistically impossible, Agent Chin explained. Small lakes in rural Minnesota don't experience that many unexplained disappearances unless someone is making people disappear. In 2024, when drought conditions dropped Clearwater Lake to historic lows, construction worker Billy Voss wasn't looking for a 40-year-old mystery. He was using a metal detector to clear the area before a new boat launch installation. What he found changed everything. Partially buried in the lake bed was a blue Chevy station wagon. The same make, model, and color as the car Mark Hendricks had driven to the lake in 1985. But when authorities arrived and examined the vehicle, they discovered something that made the case infinitely more disturbing. The car was empty. No bodies, no personal belongings, no evidence the Hendricks family had ever been inside it. But the trunk contained something that hadn't been there in 1985. Dozens of personal items from multiple missing person cases spanning decades. Children's toys, jewelry, clothing, wallets, and identification documents. All from people who had vanished near Clearwater Lake. All carefully preserved in waterproof containers. It was a trophy collection, Agent Chin said. Someone had been taking people from this area for years and keeping souvenirs. But the most disturbing discovery was a waterproof case containing hundreds of photographs. Images of families and individuals who had disappeared, taken moments before their disappearances. The photos showed people who looked terrified, confused, being led or forced by unseen captors. The final photo in the collection was of the Hendricks family on December 14, 1985. They were standing on the ice, no longer skating. Mark's hands were raised in surrender. Susan was holding both children close to her body. Behind them, barely visible at the edge of the frame, were 2 figures in dark clothing. On the back of the photo, written in block letters, "Final subjects, Project Clearwater terminated." The submerged car was just the beginning. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a complex of structures beneath the lake bed, concrete bunkers, tunnels, and chambers that had been built decades earlier and later flooded when the lake level rose. It was a facility, Agent Chin explained, purpose-built for holding people. Multiple rooms, ventilation systems, drainage, electricity. Someone had constructed an underground complex specifically designed for kidnapping and containment. Divers exploring the submerged structures found evidence of long-term habitation: beds, kitchens, bathrooms, and holding cells. The facility could have housed dozens of people simultaneously. But they also found something else: a records room with filing cabinets full of documents that had been vacuum sealed to survive underwater storage. The files revealed the scope of what had been happening at Clearwater Lake for over 2 decades. The documents recovered from the underwater facility told the story of a covert operation that had used Clearwater Lake as a testing ground for psychological and behavioral research on kidnapped civilians. Starting in 1975, a group calling itself the Clearwater Research Institute had been abducting individuals and families from across the Midwest, bringing them to the underground facility, and subjecting them to various forms of psychological experimentation. The research focused on memory manipulation, trauma response, and behavioral conditioning. Subjects were held for weeks or months, subjected to various forms of psychological pressure, and then either released with altered memories or, if they proved resistant to conditioning, eliminated. It was human experimentation on a massive scale, Agent Chin said. They were testing methods of mind control and psychological manipulation using kidnapped civilians as test subjects. The facility was funded through a complex network of shell companies and government contracts, though the exact source of funding was obscured by layers of bureaucratic secrecy. Several names in the documents suggested connections to military intelligence and private defense contractors. Mark Hendricks had become a target because of his job at the lumber mill. He'd been delivering supplies to the facility for months, not knowing what the remote research station was really being used for. When he accidentally witnessed something he shouldn't have, a transport of new subjects, he became a security risk. They didn't just kill Mark, Agent Chin explained. They took his whole family to make it look like a tragic accident rather than a targeted elimination. The files contained detailed records of everyone involved in Project Clearwater. Scientists, security personnel, administrators, and local law enforcement officers who had been paid to look the other way or actively participate in cover-ups. Deputy Tom Morrison, who had conducted the inadequate investigation of the Hendricks disappearance, had received monthly payments of $2,000 from 1978 to 1987 in exchange for ensuring that missing person cases near the lake were quickly closed without real investigation. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a psychiatrist from Minneapolis, had designed the psychological experiments and personally overseen the conditioning of high-value subjects. Her notes described in clinical detail the process of breaking down families psychologically before using them for research. James Kellner, who owned the land around Clearwater Lake, had allowed the facility to be built on his property in exchange for a percentage of the research funding. He had also helped identify potential subjects by monitoring visitors to the lake and reporting on families who seemed isolated or unlikely to be missed. But the most disturbing name in the files was that of Sheriff Dale Hawkins, who had officially led the investigation into the Hendricks disappearance. He hadn't just covered up the case, he had actively participated in the selection and abduction of subjects. The entire law enforcement system in that county was compromised, Agent Chin said. From deputies to the sheriff to the county medical examiner. They weren't investigating disappearances, they were facilitating them. Among the documents was a list of subjects who had been released after successful conditioning. These individuals had been returned to society with altered memories and no recollection of their time at the facility. The FBI began tracking down these survivors, now middle-aged adults living across the country. What they found was a pattern of psychological trauma, memory gaps, and unexplained phobias that aligned with the types of conditioning described in the research documents. Maria Santos, now 52, had been abducted with her family during a camping trip in 1983 when she was 11 years old. She had no memory of being missing, but medical records showed she had been treated for severe psychological trauma during that time period, which her family had attributed to witnessing her parents' death in what they believed was a bear attack. Under hypnosis, Maria began recovering memories of the underground facility, the experiments, and watching her parents die not from a bear attack but from medical procedures conducted by Dr. Warren's research team. "They kept me for 6 months," Maria said. "They made me watch what they did to my parents. They said it was to test how children respond to trauma. When they were done with me, they drugged me and left me in the woods where hunters would find me." 16 survivors were located. All had similar stories of memory gaps, unexplained trauma, and medical records that didn't match their recovered memories. All had been children when they disappeared, making them easier to condition and control. None of their families had survived. Parents and adult siblings had been eliminated to ensure no one would ask questions about the children's altered memories or extended absences. As the FBI investigation expanded, it became clear that Project Clearwater had been shut down in 1987 not because of ethical concerns, but because it had become a security risk. Too many people were going missing in too small an area. Media attention was beginning to focus on the unusual number of disappearances around Clearwater Lake. The facility was flooded by redirecting a nearby creek and raising the lake level by 8 feet. The underground complex was permanently submerged, and the area was designated as a protected wildlife habitat to prevent future development or investigation. Dr. Elizabeth Warren died in a car accident in 1988, just 3 months after the facility was shut down. Sheriff Dale Hawkins retired early and moved to Florida, where he died of a heart attack in 1995. James Kellner sold his property to the state and moved to Arizona, where he lived quietly until his death in 2003. Deputy Tom Morrison was the only key participant still alive when the investigation reopened in 2024. When FBI agents arrived to question him, they found him dead in his home from an apparent suicide. A note beside his body read simply, "I'm sorry for what we did to those families." Everyone involved in the project either died or disappeared within a few years of it being shut down, Agent Chin said. Someone made sure there would be no witnesses left to testify about what happened. As investigators pieced together the full scope of Project Clearwater, the true scale of the operation became horrifying. The facility had operated for 12 years, from 1975 to 1987. During that time, an estimated 200 to 300 people had been abducted and brought to the underground complex. Most never left alive. The research focused on breaking down family bonds, testing the limits of psychological endurance, and developing methods for creating compliant subjects who could be controlled through trauma-based conditioning. Children were separated from parents and forced to watch their families undergo painful medical procedures. Parents were tortured in front of their children to test protective instincts and emotional breaking points. Families were pit against each other in psychological experiments designed to destroy trust and attachment. It wasn't just kidnapping, Agent Chin explained. It was systematic psychological torture designed to study human behavior under extreme stress. They were using innocent families as laboratory animals. The Hendricks family had been among the final subjects before the facility was shut down. Their abduction had been planned for weeks, with Mark's growing suspicion and fear documented in the research files. Mark knew something was wrong, Agent Chin said. The files show he had started asking questions about the deliveries he was making to the facility. He had seen things that made him suspicious. They took his family not just to eliminate him, but to test whether fear of losing loved ones could be used to control uncooperative subjects. Despite recovering thousands of documents and interviewing dozens of survivors, many questions about Project Clearwater remain unanswered. Who funded the operation? The financial records led through a maze of shell companies and government contracts, but the ultimate source of the millions of dollars required to build and operate the facility was never definitively identified. Why was Clearwater Lake chosen as the location? The isolated area provided privacy, but the facility required significant infrastructure and resources to construct. Someone with considerable power and influence had selected this specific location for the operation. Were there other facilities? Some documents referenced sister sites and parallel operations, suggesting Project Clearwater may have been part of a larger network of research facilities conducting similar experiments. What happened to the bodies? The underground facility contained evidence that hundreds of people had been held there, but only a few dozen bodies were recovered from sealed chambers. The remains of most subjects were never found. We may never know the full truth about what happened at Clearwater Lake, Agent Chin admitted. Too many records were destroyed, too many participants are dead, and too much time has passed. But what we do know is disturbing enough. In May 2024, the FBI officially reclassified the Hendricks disappearance as a solved homicide case. Mark, Susan, Emma, and Jake Hendricks had been kidnapped and murdered as part of a covert psychological research operation that had targeted hundreds of innocent civilians over more than a decade. The surviving victims filed a class action lawsuit against the federal government, alleging that Project Clearwater had been funded by military intelligence agencies conducting illegal human experimentation. As of this writing, the case is still pending in federal court. Clearwater Lake was drained completely in late 2024, revealing the full extent of the underground facility. The complex included more than 30 rooms, multiple laboratories, and a crematorium that explained why so few bodies had been recovered. The lake will not be refilled. The area has been designated as a memorial site for the victims of Project Clearwater, though public access remains restricted pending the ongoing federal investigation. Carol Brennan, now 85 and still living in her cabin overlooking the empty lake bed, finally told the complete truth about what she witnessed on December 14, 1985. "I watched them take that family," she said. "I saw the van, I saw the men on the ice, and I was too scared to say anything. I've lived with that guilt for 40 years. Those children might be alive today if I had been braver." But Agent Chin doesn't believe Carol's testimony would have saved the Hendricks family. The entire system was corrupt, he said. If she had reported the van and the men on the ice, Deputy Morrison would have buried that information just like he buried everything else. The people running Project Clearwater had too much power and too much to lose. They would have eliminated Carol too. The Hendricks family was never found. Despite draining the lake, searching the facility, and interviewing survivors, no trace of Mark, Susan, Emma, or Jake was ever recovered. But the truth about their disappearance is now known. They didn't vanish in a freak accident or fall through thin ice. They were kidnapped by a covert research operation that treated human beings as expendable test subjects. They died not because of bad luck or natural disaster, but because a group of people with money, power, and government connections decided that some lives were worth less than others. The case has been closed, but justice remains elusive. Most of the people responsible for Project Clearwater died years ago, taking their secrets with them. The survivors received financial settlements from the government, but no amount of money can compensate for years of torture and the loss of their families. Today, the dried lake bed at Clearwater Lake sits empty and silent. Warning signs mark the perimeter, though they don't explain the real reason the area is off-limits. But sometimes, on quiet winter days, visitors report hearing sounds from the empty basin. Children's laughter echoing from the concrete ruins. Voices calling for help from chambers that haven't held water in months. The lake is gone, but the memories remain. And somewhere in those memories, Mark and Susan Hendricks are still trying to protect their children, still believing that love is stronger than the evil that men do. The mystery of their disappearance has been solved. But the mystery of how society allows such evil to flourish in secret, that remains unsolved. And in a world where people with power can make entire families vanish without consequence, perhaps the most disturbing mystery is how many other Clearwater lakes are still operating, still hidden, still taking families who will never be found. Because the real horror of Project Clearwater wasn't that it happened. It's that it probably never stopped.